What is up everybody, my name's LeakyTapsMan and this is another wishlist video in which I tell you guys what I'd like to see in the sequel to an established game, and this week I'm going to go for Mafia 3. Now I never had the pleasure of playing Mafia 1 to a great extent. I played it for an hour or so, but at the time I didn't have a PC capable of running the game, and even now that I do, I've just never got around to it. So I'll apologise straight off the bat if a lot of these things sound oriented more towards improving Mafia 2 over the original. I know the original was by and large considered much better. But anyhow, I think these changes would apply regardless in a lot of cases. Okay, for the story, there's a lot of buzz that the story may pick up where Mafia 2 left off, and I'm going to give a massive spoiler alert here, so if you haven't finished Mafia 2, I don't know why you're watching this to begin with, but close your ears. Okay, so we saw Joe being driven off in the car, and we don't know for sure if he died, but we can kind of assume it. That's not to say he died, that's not to say he definitely died, but I think it was more the developers going for that mobster mysterious finish rather than trying to end the whole thing on a cliffhanger. And not that I would be against continuing with Vito and that whole storyline, because I really thought the characters were actually quite superb, but me personally, I would like to see a whole new setting and a new protagonist, ideally. The logical thing in terms of timeline would be to progress to the 1960s, seeing as the first one was the 20s to 30s and then the second one was the 40s to 50s. I'm not sure if I'd actually want to go to the 60s. I think the 40s and 50s is a great timeline still, but I certainly wouldn't be against going to the 60s. I think if they were going to up sticks and move to a new location, I'd like to see somewhere akin to Las Vegas, where Mafia input is a very big thing, and the location is just a very interesting one. There's obviously a hell of a lot to do in Las Vegas. But I've dabbled enough in the story and timeline, I feel. Obviously tell me what you guys would want. As for the main features itself, Mafia 3 needs a complete free roam mode. And I'm not talking about loading up a mission and driving around the city, because I don't count that as free roam. I'm talking about in between missions, let us roam the city, let us acquire collectibles, and this ties into my next one, make the city feel more alive. Because in Mafia 2, yeah, there was a fair amount of pedestrians, but it didn't have that populated feel that the likes of Grand Theft Auto had, where citizens go about doing their own thing. They all just seemed very static, and it's little things like people bumping into each other or asking for change that really breathe a lot of life into the city. I know it's a small thing on paper, but it's those little nuances that can really leave a lasting impression, and I think Mafia could excel at this, but it really didn't in the second. And along with making the city feel more alive, there needs to be far more to do outside of the main missions. Side missions should just be the standard open world fare where you can let us collect cars, stuff like that, hitman missions. And obviously if you're in the mob, you've got a hell of a lot to do in terms of side missions. You got things like mafia wars between two families, racketeering, loan sharking. I mean, think of everything that the Mafia supposedly does, and it can probably be a side mission. And although if it somewhat contradicts my last suggestion of making the city feel more alive, I would like the map to be increased in physical size, because I felt Empire Bay was too small really. Not extensively too small, but it felt a bit lacking compared to other open world games. But as I said, if they make those previous improvements, I wouldn't really mind if they didn't increase the size that much. As long as there's a multitude of things to do, I guess you wouldn't really notice the size as much. Oh, and one thing I failed to mention with the whole Mafia aspect of the side missions, I'd love for us to be able to purchase property. The fact that you're in the Mafia basically means that after a certain amount of time or notoriety, you should be able to run a town, and it seemed kind of odd that we couldn't even buy a building, so I'd love to see that in some form. I'd also like to see a lot more choices within the missions, because if the game does stay with single player, which I would in all honesty prefer, then there needs to be far more replayability, because Mafia 2 was linear as hell, and although the missions and the story were quite good in my opinion, I'd have loved to have had some actual influence, in the sense that maybe you could whack a snitch, or you could choose to have him flee the country, or have him work for you, something like that. Or choosing a particular mob family over another one. I think there's a hell of a lot of scope for moral choices within missions. I mean, Mafia 2 was supposed to have 4 endings, and then they cut it down to just one, which kind of reflects the fact that they went down the linear route, which I guess their reasoning was justified when they said that only one ending was worthwhile. But games like Deus Ex prove that you can have multiple endings and they can work, and work very well, so I'd just love to see a lot more replayability within the missions if they decide to keep this single player, which I reiterate again, I would prefer. and I'll go through some more minor things. I would very much like to see the ability to use public transport or taxis to go around. Driving the same set of cars and just stealing cars basically is quite tedious towards the end. Even if taxis just took you to a certain borough instead of the exact location, just something on top of driving a car to get around. And when we're in a car, I'd love to be able to actually shoot out of the bloody window. Getting a Tommy gun and spraying out of the back of a vintage car is absolutely synonymous with classic mobsters, and I don't get why we couldn't do it. Fair enough if we're driving, that's fine, but I'd like the passengers to be able to whip out a gun and just start spraying, because we could get shot at by cops and we couldn't shoot back. Kind of a mismatch if you ask me. And although incredibly premature, downloadable content, I'd love to see something far more substantial along the lines of Grand Theft Auto 4, where they had the Lost and Damned and they had the Ballad of Gay Tony, and they gave a really sizable amount of content for the money. Maybe I've been spoilt by Rockstar with the wealth of content that they actually give, but I think Mafia could do something akin to that, even if they have to up the price, but include more than just basic missions, include some side missions, some more collectibles, and just make it feel like more of an expansion pack than a cheap cash-in. And a couple of minor things to finish on. Keep time limits within missions to an absolute minimum, because they are just an absolute ball ache, especially when you're driving and people like me can't drive for crap, and it's quite frustrating. And I'd also like to see melee weapons. It seemed odd that we could have fist fights but not use a weapon like a baseball bat or a crowbar or a knife or anything like that. Okay, so that more or less summarises everything that I would like to see in Mafia 3. And as always, I call upon you guys to give me your ideas and suggestions. Do you think multiplayer would work in Mafia? I think it could work, but I think that the resources that it requires and the manpower would mean that the single player would probably suffer as a result. And there is nothing worse than seeing a multiplayer that just looks tacked on. But anyway, thanks very much for watching. Hit the like button if you like any of this. Please subscribe to me if you haven't already. It's very appreciated. And you can follow my ass on Twitter. The link will be in the description. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.